Snow fell in whispers over the ruins of Berlin, drifting like ash from a sky that had run out of prayers. Along the broken avenue once called Unter den Linden, a column of children shuffled forward, thin legs wrapped in wool too large for them, rifles slung awkwardly over bony shoulders. Their faces were gray with soot, but their eyes, those hollow blue and brown mirrors, still carried something wild and fevered. The Reich had called them its last hope. They were, in truth, its last children. Among them marched a 15-year-old girl with braids stiff from the cold and a coat that had belonged to a dead officer. Her name, whispered once by a mother now buried under rubble, no longer seemed to matter. She had been taught to salute, to hate, to die smiling if necessary. Yet as the columns of smoke from the city curled toward heaven, she felt none of the glory promised by the posters still clinging to the walls. She only felt the numbness of hunger and the ache of boots too small for growing feet. They were part of the Volkssturm, the people's storm, a final, desperate creation of a crumbling empire. Boys barely old enough to shave, girls who had once danced in the Bund Deutscher Madel parades, now handed rifles with trembling hands. Commanders barked orders over the thunder of distant artillery, their voices breaking through the winter like dying radios. The children nodded, pretending to understand, pretending not to fear. In the quiet moments between explosions, they recited lines of devotion they had learned in school: faith, obedience, sacrifice. Words once sweet as songs now tasted like iron on their tongues. They were told the Americans were beasts, giants who would burn, defile, and destroy everything German. That to surrender was worse than death. So they clung to their weapons not out of courage, but out of terror. The girl had a photograph tucked in her pocket, a faded image of her younger brother, gone missing during the evacuation of Breslau. She had promised to find him. Promises were the only currency left in the war's final months, and even they were losing value. Around her, the other girls whispered of ghosts and saints, of rumors that Hitler himself had vanished into the Alps. But the officers still came each morning, uniforms creased, eyes hollow, handing out rations of black bread and brittle faith. When the shelling paused, she could hear the crows. They gathered on burned-out rooftops, watching like dark judges. The children joked that they were waiting to see who would fall next. One boy, 14, freckles dusted with ash, made a paper plane from a propaganda leaflet that promised victory. He threw it toward the gray sky, and they watched it tumble, caught by the wind, spinning down into the cratered street. For a heartbeat, laughter returned to the world. Then a mortar landed nearby and erased it. By late April, the front line had dissolved into confusion. Orders came through that meant nothing: defend this street, retreat from that bridge, hold until dawn, even when dawn had stopped coming. The girl's unit was scattered near the Spree River. She followed an older boy who claimed to know the way to the Reich Chancellery. When they reached it, they found only smoke and silence. A group of men in tattered uniforms stood around a burnt flag, muttering that the Führer was dead. Someone laughed. Someone else cried. The boy fell to his knees and began praying, though no one remembered to whom. She walked away from them, down a street lined with the bodies of soldiers who had once been her teachers, her neighbors, her idols. They looked peaceful now, as if sleep had finally found them. For the first time, she felt the weight of what they had been made to believe. Children of the Reich, they had called themselves. Yet now the Reich was gone, and all that remained were children. Night crept in, and the city's glow was no longer from street lamps but from burning fuel depots. The air smelled of smoke and surrender. She stumbled into a ruined courtyard where a group of girls huddled around a dying fire. Their uniforms mismatched, faces smudged with soot, they shared a single tin of condensed milk, precious as gold. They passed it wordlessly from hand to hand, each taking a spoonful like communion. When it reached her, she hesitated. The sweetness burned her throat, foreign after months of starvation. She began to cry quietly, the tears freezing on her cheeks. One of the older girls, her arm wrapped in a bloodied bandage, leaned close and whispered, "They said the Americans are close. Maybe they'll kill us quick." Her voice carried no fear, only exhaustion. Another girl answered, "Maybe they'll feed us first." They both laughed, softly, like ghosts telling jokes at their own funeral. Somewhere beyond the city's edge, engines rumbled, a sound like the heartbeat of something enormous and alive. The girl clutched her rifle and tried to steady her hands. Every story she had heard painted the approaching soldiers as monsters. But something inside her, some forgotten instinct of childhood, whispered that monsters didn't bring engines that sounded like freedom. When morning came, the sky was pale as old parchment. The gunfire had slowed, replaced by the distant thud of boots and the crackle of radios. She crept to a broken window and saw them, figures moving carefully through the ruins, helmets glinting, flags she did not recognize fluttering faintly in the wind. The Americans. Her heart pounded so hard she thought they would hear it. The other girls froze, waiting for the inevitable. They imagined fire, bullets, punishment for all they had done and believed. The girl raised her rifle halfway, then lowered it again. Her arms trembled not from fear but from uncertainty, an emotion she had never been taught to feel. As the soldiers drew nearer, she saw their faces, tired, young, unshaven. One of them looked no older than her brother. He saw her too, a small silhouette framed by shattered glass, and instead of raising his weapon, he lifted a hand in cautious greeting. She blinked, uncertain whether it was a trick. Behind her, someone whispered, "Don't move. They'll shoot." But she could not obey. The boy soldier outside smiled faintly. Then, slowly, he reached into his pocket and tossed something into the rubble near her feet. It was small, wrapped in shiny paper. A piece of chocolate. The girl stared at it as if it were a live grenade. Around her, the others waited for an explosion that never came. The soldier nodded once, then moved on, disappearing into the fog of smoke and snow. In that moment, the girl understood that everything she had been told about the enemy might have been a lie, and that the real war, the one for her soul, had only just begun. The first thing she noticed was the silence, an unnatural, almost tender silence that followed the thunder of war. It was broken only by the crunch of boots over glass and the faint jingle of canteens. The girl pressed herself against a collapsed doorway, her rifle slipping from numb fingers. Across the square, through drifting smoke, came the silhouettes of the Americans. They moved cautiously, rifles at the ready, but there was no cruelty in their steps, no shouting, no wild victory. Only watchfulness. Only weariness. A man with a red cross stitched to his sleeve knelt beside a body she recognized as one of her comrades, a boy who had believed dying was the highest form of loyalty. The medic touched his throat, then covered his face with a piece of cloth. The gesture startled her. She had expected desecration, not respect. The Americans were supposed to be monsters, men who drank from skulls and laughed at pain. That was what the posters, the teachers, the officers had said. But the man's movements were slow, deliberate, almost sorrowful. Her hands shook as she pulled her coat tighter around herself, trying to make her smallness invisible. Then she heard a voice, deep, calm, carried by the wind. "There's another one over here." She froze. A beam of sunlight caught her face, reflecting off a shard of broken windowpane. A soldier approached, his helmet shadowing his eyes, his rifle lowered. She wanted to run, but her legs betrayed her. When he stopped a few paces away, she could smell tobacco and mud, and something else, soap. It was the cleanest scent she'd known in months. He spoke again, slowly, as if talking to a frightened animal. "You don't need that," he said, nodding toward her fallen rifle. She stared back, unable to understand the words but understanding the tone. His voice didn't carry hatred, it carried fatigue, the kind that comes when one has seen too much. She hesitated, then bent down and pushed the rifle toward him across the ground. The metal scraped against stone like a whisper of surrender. He called out, and two others joined him. They were young, one dark-haired, the other freckled, both with faces that seemed too gentle for the battlefield. One offered her a tin cup filled with water. Her fingers trembled as she accepted it, the cold liquid shocking her throat. She expected interrogation, punishment, something cruel. Instead, the freckled one handed her a small square of chocolate, wrapped in foil. "Eat," he said. She didn't know the word, but his eyes told her what it meant. The sweetness made her cry. She turned away, embarrassed, wiping her face with a dirty sleeve. The soldiers exchanged glances, not laughter, but something closer to pity. "Kid," one muttered softly. "She's just a kid." By midday, the square had filled with the captured and the lost. Young Germans, Boys in patched uniforms, girls in makeshift coats, sat in small groups, their eyes darting between the Americans and the ruins that had once been their city. The soldiers offered food, bandages, blankets. They spoke kindly, even joked among themselves. One played a harmonica, a trembling tune that somehow survived the air thick with smoke. The melody floated over the rubble like a ghost searching for home. The girl watched in disbelief. The propaganda had warned that surrender meant death, that the Americans would carve swastikas into their skin. Yet here they were, pouring soup into dented metal cups, sharing cigarettes with trembling prisoners. Mercy, it seemed, had replaced vengeance. It made no sense. When a jeep arrived carrying more soldiers, one of the officers, a tall man with gray stubble and eyes the color of river mud, surveyed the square. He barked an order, and the captured youths were herded together, not roughly, but with military precision. The girl flinched as his gaze swept over her. Then he did something that would remain carved into her memory forever. He smiled. Not mockingly, but with a strange, tired kindness, as though he were looking at his own daughter through the wrong side of time. "You'll be all right," he said softly, almost to himself. The prisoners were marched through the streets, past skeletons of buildings and the ghosts of what had been. Civilians peered from windows, their faces drawn tight with hunger and disbelief. Children stared at other children in uniforms and wondered how anyone could still look proud in defeat. The Americans moved alongside them, keeping distance but never striking. A few tossed bread to the younger ones. When one boy lunged too quickly, a soldier gently steadied him by the shoulder, murmuring something like, "Easy, son." At dusk they reached the edge of the city, where a camp had been established in a former train depot. The air smelled of wood smoke and disinfectant. Rows of tents fluttered in the fading light. It was not a prison, though it wore the shape of one. Guards stood watch, but their faces were soft, their posture human. The girl was led to a medical station where a nurse, a woman with auburn hair tucked beneath a cap, examined the frostbite on her hands. The nurse's touch was firm but gentle. "You poor thing," she whispered, almost motherly. The girl didn't understand the words, but the tone was a language older than war. Later, she sat by a small fire, clutching a metal bowl of stew. Around her, the Americans laughed quietly, trading stories about farms, baseball, girls waiting back home. One mimed milking a cow, and the others groaned. Their laughter was not cruel. It was alive. For the first time in months, the girl felt the sound of laughter without fear attached. When night came, the camp settled under the glow of lanterns. Somewhere, a radio played a soft tune in English. The girl lay awake, her body warm for the first time since winter began. She thought of everything she had been told, the beasts, the devils, the warnings of eternal torment, and felt confusion gnaw at her like hunger. Could mercy truly come from an enemy? Could goodness survive even in the one she had been taught to hate? She turned over, clutching the chocolate wrapper in her pocket. It gleamed faintly in the firelight, a small piece of impossible evidence. She thought of her brother again, of the photo still folded inside her coat. If he were alive, what would he think of this strange new world, one where kindness felt more terrifying than cruelty? Outside the tent, she heard footsteps and low voices. The officer with gray stubble stopped near the entrance. "Tomorrow we move them out," he said to another. "Some of these kids don't even know the war's over." His voice carried a weight that sounded like regret. As he walked away, the girl's eyes filled with tears she didn't understand. Somewhere beyond the darkness, dawn was already pressing against the horizon, fragile and pale. She closed her eyes, and for the first time, dreamed not of marching or dying, but of waking up to a world where mercy looked less like madness, and more like a beginning. The camp smelled of wet canvas and boiled cabbage, a strange scent of survival that drifted across the muddy grounds each morning. The girl woke to the rattle of tin bowls and the hum of voices, English words she couldn't yet understand, though she had begun to recognize their rhythms. The Americans rose early, lighting fires that flickered gold against the gray dawn, and somewhere beyond the rows of tents, someone was always singing softly. She listened to the sound and thought it must be what peace felt like, uncertain, fragile, but alive. She had been in the camp for nearly a week, though time no longer obeyed its old logic. Days melted into one another, each marked by small mercies: warm soup, clean bandages, laughter shared through gestures instead of words. The guards were soldiers, but not like the ones she'd known before. They smiled when they spoke, tipped their helmets when the nurses passed, and shared cigarettes with prisoners who dared to ask. It felt like living in a world turned upside down, where enemies offered kindness and no one demanded loyalty in return. Her name was called that morning, first in a clumsy attempt by an American sergeant, then correctly by the German interpreter beside him. She stood at attention out of instinct. Old habits died slowly, like frost in the sun. The interpreter smiled, a young woman in a Red Cross uniform who looked too soft for war. "They want you to help in the kitchen," she said gently. "Can you cook?" The girl nodded. She had learned once, before the bombs came, potatoes, cabbage, the simple alchemy of hunger turned into warmth. She followed the interpreter to the mess tent, where steam rolled out in thick waves and pots clanged like bells. The sergeant overseeing it was round-faced, red-cheeked, and always humming. He introduced himself as Tom, though she only caught the sound of his name after several tries. He pointed to the pile of vegetables and mimed chopping, then smiled as she picked up the knife. Cooking was a language she remembered fluently. Her hands moved without thinking, slicing through potatoes with precision, stirring the pot in slow circles. The air filled with the scent of garlic and broth, and for the first time since the war began, she felt useful in a way that didn't involve obedience or fear. Tom watched her work, nodding in approval, then offered a mock salute. She almost smiled. Almost. At noon, the prisoners lined up for food. Some still wore tattered uniforms, badges hastily removed or sewn over. The Americans didn't ask names or ranks. They simply served everyone. The girl ladled soup into bowls until her wrists ached. When she looked up, she caught sight of the freckled soldier who had given her chocolate on the day of capture. He winked, holding out his bowl like a mischievous schoolboy. She blushed and poured him an extra spoonful. He grinned, tapping his helmet in thanks before walking away. That afternoon, rain swept through the camp in heavy sheets. The children, because that's what most of them truly were, raced outside, laughing as they danced in the mud. The Americans shouted half-heartedly for them to come in, but no one obeyed. The laughter spread like wildfire, rolling across the camp in waves. Even the guards began to smile. The girl stood under the eaves of the kitchen tent, watching them. Something in her chest loosened, something she hadn't known was clenched. She wanted to join them, but the habit of caution still chained her. Later, when the rain slowed to a drizzle, she sat beneath a makeshift awning with the interpreter, who offered her a notebook and pencil. "Write home," the woman said. "They're collecting letters. Maybe they'll reach your family." The girl hesitated. She hadn't written since before the collapse of Breslau. The paper looked too clean, too pure for the filth of her story. "Still," she began. The first words were halting, the letters shaky. "Mama, I am alive." She stared at the sentence for a long time, tears dripping onto the page. By evening, fires burned in a dozen small circles around the camp. Soldiers and prisoners sat together, trading songs in broken languages. Someone passed around a harmonica again, and the melody drifted over the darkening field. The girl sat near Tom, who offered her a spoonful of stew thicker than the morning's. "Best we've got," he said, and even though she couldn't understand, the warmth of his voice translated perfectly. It was then she began to notice the change within herself. Not sudden, but steady, like light growing after a storm. The fear that once clung to her like a second skin began to peel away. These men who could have treated her as an enemy instead treated her as someone's daughter. In their laughter, she heard a truth her teachers had buried, that mercy could exist even in the hands of those you were told to hate. Still, at night, memories returned uninvited. The sound of sirens, the face of the boy who'd thrown his paper airplane before dying. She dreamed of her brother, his small hand slipping from hers amid the chaos of the evacuation. Each time she woke, the noise of the camp reminded her that she had survived, but the guilt of it pressed heavy on her chest. Survival was a strange gift. It came wrapped in sorrow. One morning, a convoy of trucks arrived, stirring the camp into motion. Orders rippled through the tents. Some prisoners would be transferred to larger facilities for formal processing. The girl's name was on the list. The interpreter told her she would likely be released soon. "You're just a child," she said kindly. But the girl wasn't sure what being a child meant anymore. Before she left, Tom handed her a small tin wrapped in cloth. Inside were 2 pieces of chocolate and a folded slip of paper. He gestured for her to open it. The note read, in careful block letters, "Good luck, kid." She looked up at him, unable to speak. He just smiled and tipped his hat, as if farewells were nothing special. The trucks roared to life. Rain began to fall again, light this time, turning the mud into mirrors. The girl climbed into the back, the tin clutched to her chest. As the convoy pulled away, she looked out over the camp, the smoke, the tents, the faint glow of firelight flickering in puddles. It was a place built from contradiction, a prison that had taught her freedom, an enemy's ground that had given her hope. She thought of the Americans standing in the rain, watching them leave. One of them, freckled, smiling, raised his hand in a silent goodbye. She raised hers in return. The wind caught her hair, lifting it like a flag of surrender, or perhaps, finally, of peace. Years later, she would say that the smell of spring rain always carried her back to that camp. The sound of tents flapping in the wind, the laughter of soldiers who had once been her enemies, and the strange sweetness of chocolate melting too fast on her tongue. The war had ended, yet its echoes never stopped humming beneath the surface of her life. She was 17 when the Americans released her, barefoot and rail-thin, with a small tin box pressed into her hands. Inside were the 2 pieces of chocolate Tom had given her and the letter she'd written to a mother she never found again. The train that carried her home moved through a country that no longer knew itself. Towns lay flattened, forests burned to stumps, rivers ran dark with ash. Germany was not a nation. It was a wound. The train stopped often, sometimes for repairs, sometimes for reasons no one explained. At each station, people gathered with hollow eyes, trading bread for news, names for rumors. She saw other girls like her, former auxiliaries, orphan soldiers of a dead cause, wandering in borrowed clothes, searching for homes that no longer existed. In one small village near Kassel, she stepped off the train and never got back on. The countryside was green again, absurdly alive after so much death. Farmers worked fields beside bomb craters. Church bells rang, hesitant, as if asking permission. She found shelter in a half-collapsed farmhouse, working for a widow who needed help with the animals. The woman never asked questions, and the girl never volunteered answers. Each morning she woke to the smell of hay and the sound of roosters, and each night she dreamt of engines and fire. The Americans came through often in those months, convoys delivering supplies, patrols ensuring order. She would watch them pass from the edge of the field, the insignias on their trucks gleaming in the sun. Once, one of the soldiers spotted her and waved. She froze, unsure how to respond. His face was kind, but kindness still frightened her. It had rewritten too much of what she believed. By 1947, Reconstruction had begun. She moved to a nearby town where the Red Cross ran a small orphanage. They needed hands and patience, and she had both. She taught younger children how to read, using scraps of old books salvaged from bomb schools. At night, when the power failed, she lit a candle and wrote in a small notebook, the first she'd owned since the camp. Her words were simple, shaky, but deliberate. War teaches you to survive. Mercy teaches you to live. One day, a group of foreign visitors arrived at the orphanage, American officers and aid workers inspecting the progress of relief programs. She recognized one of them instantly, the freckled soldier with the shy grin. Time had changed him. He was broader now, older, with lines around his eyes. When their gazes met, he looked startled, then quietly pleased. He approached her after the inspection, holding his cap awkwardly in both hands. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again," he said softly. She still struggled with English, but she understood the rhythm of gratitude in his tone. He asked if she was well, if she had family. She shook her head, smiling faintly. He hesitated, then reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a familiar object, a tin of chocolate, still wrapped in foil. "Guess some things don't change," he said. She laughed, a real, unguarded laugh that startled even her. They talked for nearly an hour in a mix of broken words and gestures. He told her he'd gone home to Illinois, that he'd built houses for returning veterans but couldn't forget the faces of the children he'd seen. "We thought we'd saved the world," he said, But some days it feels like we only swept the ashes. She told him, slowly, haltingly, that his kindness had saved her life more than any rescue mission ever could. When he left, he pressed the tin into her hand again. "You keep it," he said. "A reminder that mercy's the only weapon worth carrying." Then he was gone, swallowed by the noise of the trucks and the bright white sunlight that made the world look almost innocent again. Years folded into decades. Germany rebuilt itself, stone by stone, lesson by lesson. The girl became a woman, then a teacher, then an old woman with silver hair and a tremor in her voice. She taught her students not about glory or nations, but about empathy, the kind born from hunger, grief, and forgiveness. She kept the chocolate tin on her desk for 50 years, its metal dulled, its contents long since gone. When students asked what it was, she would smile and say, "Proof that goodness can survive even in hell." But not all wounds healed quietly. Some nights, when storms rolled across the sky, she woke to the echo of boots and sirens, to the sound of children marching where they should have been playing. She'd light a candle and sit by the window, watching the rain slide down the glass like memory itself, relentless and cleansing. She knew she would never escape the past completely, but she had learned to live alongside it. Mercy had not erased the pain. It had given it shape, meaning, and a reason to end. In 1985, on the 40th anniversary of the war's end, she returned to Berlin for a remembrance ceremony. The city was whole again, though it wore its history like faint scars beneath new skin. Veterans, survivors, and children of both sides gathered in a small park near the river. There were speeches about unity, progress, forgiveness. She stood quietly among them, holding a single white flower. As the ceremony ended, a man in a gray suit approached. He was old now, stooped, his once freckled face softened by time. They recognized each other instantly, as if no years had passed at all. He smiled, that same gentle, weary smile she had first seen through the smoke of war. "You kept living," he said simply. "I learned from you," she replied. They stood in silence as church bells began to ring across the city. Around them, children played, their laughter bright against the drizzle. She looked at them and thought of all the things Mercy had left behind. Hope, peace, the fragile promise that humanity could begin again. The rain grew heavier, dotting her coat, but she didn't move. The freckled man removed his hat, tilted it toward her, and whispered, "Guess we did all right after all." She smiled, tears lost among the raindrops. "Yes," she said. "You won the war. But Mercy won the world." Which city are you watching our video from? For more powerful stories from World War II, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Thank you.